What's up, everybody? V Club here. It's about anything and everything. Nothing's off the table. All right. I mean, literally, it's about anything and everything. Just want to share with you opinions on things that I see out there. And you can agree with me or disagree with me. It doesn't matter. I'm all up for an open discussion every time, anyway. So, I like debates. I like talking about stuff and sharing with you thoughts that I think we share in common, right? So, like this bullshit here about the restaurant closing due to ladies' night promo. Like, if you watch that, it's bullshit, right? About how just because they were doing a ladies' night at a restaurant to draw, a certain crowd in because maybe you don't get that type of crowd that comes in. And bars do that all the time, clubs do that all the time. So this restaurant gets sued for discrimination and won because it's California, it's woke. And so, being that it's California and it's woke, and they won, the restaurant has to close down by the end of the year because they say they can't come up with the money to pay for it, so they got to close business just because of some bullshit, right? Anyhow, speaking of bullshit, that parlays me over to some other bullshit I see out here, like New York Governor Kathy Hochul, how she was talking about how the subway system in New York is safe, even though they had to bring in the National Guard a few months ago to help with the policing of the subway system because it's unsafe. But she touts that it's safe, right? That's how blue cities are. Blue cities will lie in your face and tell you how things are, lying to you in your face. But then in reality, everyone else sees it differently. But yet you guys still vote liberal blue for some odd reason. Doesn't make any sense, right? But because you got these liberal blue progressive causes that's been really causing so much trouble, right? Because you get these DEI hires, you get all these unqualified people, um, that are in office running things, busting budgets, for example, to illegals. They try to martyr people, right? Because they want to be soft on crime, like New York, like Chicago, like Minnesota, like California, and the list goes on, right? And things happen, right? Timing of everything that happened cause for a situation to occur. So if you guys recall, right, defunding the police movement happened, all right, and because of everything that played, it just kind of fell into place, right, with defunding police, and then DEI and being woke and all this other bullshit, all right, happens. They had to martyr George Floyd, right? So George Floyd, if you don't know the situation what happened with George Floyd, right? He's already been a felon, all right? Did all those different crimes, going to as far as when he robbed a female at an apartment, pregnant female that is, put a gun to her belly and said, don't move if you want to live or if you want your baby to live or something like that, while him and his buddies rob her in her apartment. What kind of shit is that, right? So he's on his fentanyl high, right? And, he gets pulled over by police, right? Minneapolis police. And then, things happen, right? They say, oh, he died because of asphyxiation, and he was saying, I can't breathe, I can't breathe, and the chokehold that was applied and all that stuff. But it was proven, and it goes on and on. There's all these testimonies and evidence, and even undisclosed testimony coming from coroners that really prove to be siding with law enforcement that he had nothing to do with the death of George Floyd, right? But because of the way things were playing out at the time, the narratives and things like that during this whole timing of everything, right? They were basically politically forced to change what was said on the autopsy report, the coroners that is, and things like that, and documentations and such, just so politically it would favor George Floyd and martyr him and things like that, and then put police further in the bad light into defunding police and doing all these different things, right? Reimagining law enforcement and all that stuff, and reform law enforcement, which it didn't really do nothing except soften crime, right? Soften criminals to where they were allowed to do pretty much open book on anything, just because it's just the way law enforcement was painted in a bad light because of the situation. And so, on the surface, it's what it looked like, right? Because it's what the media has played out. And we all know now, come 4 years later, what has happened, right? That the media has been very slanted, very skewed, progressive left. And next thing you know, it's like, all right, well, you're only hearing that one-sided perspective. So they're going to do everything they can, because we have progressives running in different capacities across the United States, funded by George Soros, who's all about defunding police and soft on crime, soft on criminals, and things like that. Let things run amok for what? I don't know, but some sort of weird. He has like this weird, like, thing with criminal justice reform and all that. Like, he has a hard on for that shit. And to me, it all boils down to training and things like that, right? If you are following policy and training and things like that, we all know technology is around, right? There's going to be cameras everywhere, whether it's on a person, whether it's on, city cameras, house cameras, whatever, right? Whatever. The cameras everywhere, all right? So there's only, law enforcement can't just do anything at will, right, without getting in trouble. And so, and it happens all the time where it will catch up to them, right? If it doesn't get them right away, it will catch up to them. It always happens. So it's not like law enforcement has a free walk in the park, or they could run amok and do things at will because they're law enforcement. No, I mean, there's still policy, there's still guidelines that you got to follow, regulations, in order to fulfill the duties and capacities of being a police officer, right? And so they understand that, right? Are there going to be bad apples? Yeah, there, of course. Everywhere, in every occupation, and every different sort of facets of life, there's always going to be bad apples, right? Bad actors, bad apples. And usually that one or two would really stain the whole, whatever it is, profession, the job, the company, whatever it represents. It can stain the whole thing just because you have one or two bad apples, right? It always happens. But now what it boils down to is, did Minneapolis do the right thing in the first place, right? Because this really defined this whole George Floyd incident defined law enforcement for the last 4 years now, to come to find out that that wasn't really the case of what happened to George Floyd, right? You come to find out that he didn't die in custody, like in terms of the chokehold itself, all right? He didn't die from the hands of Chauvin. Yeah, he applied a chokehold to restrain him, right? He applied force to, hold him down, things like that. But he was still breathing. He was still alive to the point where even medical personnel arrive to perform, the life support techniques to provide, that support as George Floyd was having issues with cardiac arrest. All right, in the backseat of the car or whatever it was, right? And at that point, it was already out of the officer's hands at that point when emergency personnel arrived. So when you have that, he's still alive. They're performing, now he's having cardiac arrest, right? You come to find out later on, he was having a cardiac arrest because of, well, when you have all this drugs and stuff in your system, of course you're gonna, and then of course the adrenaline pumping, the all these different things that are going on, right? It's going to really shock your body in terms of how it's going to act and react and things like that. So of course, if you're going to have lethal amounts of drugs in your system, you are acting up, elevating your heart rate, right, and your body and all that stuff throughout movements and action. Yeah, of course, it's going to put you in cardiac arrest. Can chokeholds and I guess you could say restraint holds can cut off air circulation. Yeah, I mean it can, depending on how you're, if you're being resistive and they're just trying to hold you down, but you keep being resistive and trying to fight through it. Yeah, it's going to raise your heart. It's going to put you in a cardiac situation. So anyhow, I just wanted to give my thoughts on that, just based on what I've been hearing and reading and all that stuff. And now you come to find out there's a new report released here that could possibly overturn this whole conviction on the officer himself, that he was wrongfully convicted, but because they needed a villain, for a martyr, that's what really happened here. And it all played into this whole, DEI, being woke, defund the police, all that stuff. It just played into it because it was just the environment at the time. So I wanted to take a look into that here.
Yeah, GoDaddy
and see
Arrow
what's
is
being
so
said about
easy. AI built me a website in minutes.
Derek Chauvin was wrongly convicted of killing George Floyd in a verdict that was a result of racially energized hysteria. Those who bothered to look at the actual evidence have always known this because it was obvious. As has always been the case, the only person who killed George Floyd was George Floyd. And just days ago, a federal court provided a fresh opportunity for this simple truth to be demonstrated yet again. Let's talk about it. I am, of course, attorney Andrew Branco for Law of Self-Defense, and for those of you who stay to the end, I'll share with you how you can get a free copy of our best-selling book.
Yeah, so, I just find the George Floyd incident fascinating, and of course, when you have progressive president and the progressive agenda, they're going to push the narrative that, law enforcement is bad, police is bad, and we need criminal justice reform and all that stuff. And obviously we don't. We don't need criminal justice reform, because obviously we need criminal justice to work, and reform is not going to work. It's proven that. So it's just the whole thing that played out during this time. So let's take a further look here.
The law of self-defense principles. This has always been ridiculous force to stop wrongfully kneeling on Floyd's neck. Floyd was killed. The big lie in the death of George Floyd is that Floyd was killed by career police officer Derek Chauvin wrongfully kneeling on Floyd's neck and back with sufficient force to stop Floyd from breathing. This has always been ridiculous nonsense. There was literally zero evidence ever offered by the state that quantified how much pressure Chauvin was supposedly applying to Floyd with his murder knee. Certainly not all of Chauvin's body weight, because Chauvin's weight was also being supported by his other leg. Further, the evidence that Chauvin's murder knee was on Floyd's neck and back was both ambiguous at best. Chauvin and every police officer in the department had been taught the knee on the back restraint technique at the academy, and over his 20-year career, Chauvin had likely performed this restraint hundreds, if not thousands of times without causing any injury to a suspect. Of course, most criminal suspects hadn't presented with the constellation of comorbidities and poor life choices made by Floyd that primed him for a death that would be unforeseeable to any of the officers making a lawful arrest of this lifelong violent criminal. Perhaps most decisive of all, however, is that there existed many other means by which Floyd's death could have been caused that involved zero malice or misconduct by Chauvin. And even one credible alternative means of death, by definition, raises a reasonable doubt that it was Chauvin's malice or misconduct that caused Floyd's death, and therefore precludes a rational jury from finding guilt beyond a reasonable doubt. In fact,
Yeah, so with all that, I mean, it's been said over and over again, but they were pressing hard for a conviction, just like how New York was trying to press hard for a conviction to convict Trump, right, to throw him in jail and all that right now, or in the last few months. Same thing with this whole Derek Chauvin situation. They were trying to press hard to convict him, to make an example out of him when he did everything he was trained to do. And believe me, when it comes to following policy, and if you have a long career of following policy and what you're trained, I don't see how, that even with all the cell phone footage and all that stuff, how all that stuff can say that Derek Chauvin killed George Floyd.
I would suggest that this is actually the single best working definition of what reasonable doubt really means in the context of a criminal conviction. That is, in order for guilt to have been proven beyond any reasonable doubt, there must be no other reasonable explanation consistent with the evidence other than guilt. To put it another way, if there exists even one alternative explanation consistent with the evidence, then by definition, guilt has not been proven beyond any reasonable doubt.
There had to have been reasonable doubt.
Indeed, I would go even further and take the question out of the hands of the jury. As a matter of simple due process, every defendant is entitled to an impartial, unbiased, and rational jury. Nobody should be subject to an irrational jury. For example, a jury verdict of guilt where the prosecution failed to show any evidence on a required element of a crime would clearly be irrational and should properly be reversed by the trial judge. No need for an appeal. This is well-established law, and it results in what's called a directed verdict, or a JNOV, a judgment notwithstanding the verdict, in which the verdict is taken out of the hands of the irrational jury. Similarly, a verdict of guilt returned where there is an obvious alternative explanation consistent with the evidence other than guilt is a similar violation of due process of law and ought to be reversed by the trial judge. No need for an appeal. In the context of Derek Chauvin and George Floyd, this means that if there exists even one explanation consistent with the evidence for Floyd's death other than Chauvin's purported murder knee, the state has not proven beyond a reasonable doubt that Derek Chauvin was the culpable cause of Floyd's death. Even without the newly proposed mechanism of Floyd's death being recognized by the federal court recently, the medical examiner's report findings in the immediate aftermath of Floyd's death was full of evidence for
Exactly. So, exactly. The medical reports, the autopsy from the coroner already proved it. During the trial, it didn't have to take all these years to pass to even look at it again or to come up with new findings or whatever. It was already said and documented at the very beginning. But again, they were looking for a conviction. They were looking to really vilify Chauvin and law enforcement as a whole because of just the time of this cause here. that was happening, and it's just crazy.
Causes of death other than any malice or misconduct by Chauvin. First, Floyd was engaged by police because he had just been reported by a local convenience store as attempting to pass counterfeit currency. Coincidentally enough, standing on the sidewalk where all this went down was a local drug dealer who was frequented by Floyd. When Floyd was approached by police while in his vehicle, he shoved a handful of tablets into his mouth. Fragments of these tablets would later be found in his mouth and inside his vehicle and identified as methamphetamine. The only reasonable inference is that the convicted felon Floyd and lifelong drug user decided to quickly ingest the meth he just purchased from his drug dealer moments before, rather than have the contraband drugs found in his possession upon his arrest for the counterfeit money. Second, Floyd then violently fought lawful arrest against 4 officers for some 10 minutes. The officers were fully entitled to make Floyd's arrest on the counterfeit money suspicion, and their use of force in making that lawful arrest was also lawful. Unknowable to the officers, however, Floyd was not someone who possessed a physiology that would respond well to violently resisting lawful arrest. First, Floyd had substantial cardiovascular disease, including a badly enlarged heart and clinical hypertension. He also suffered from sickle cell anemia, which obviously impaired the normal function of the red blood cells that carry oxygen throughout his body. He also had existing metabolic disease in the form of a paraganglioma tumor in his pelvis. We'll circle back to that tumor in a moment because it's the subject of the recent federal court order we're going to discuss.
So, when you look at that, though, he already had pre-existing health problems exacerbated by the drugs he just ingested. And you put all that together, fighting with police that elevates your heart, you're at this adrenaline rush. Yeah, you're definitely going to go into cardiac arrest because of the whole shock that you're putting through your body, through of all this.
Third, along with this severely compromised physiology, unknown and unknowable to the officers making a lawful arrest of a violently resisting Floyd, along with the mouthful of meth tablets the officers could not at the time have known that Floyd had just swallowed, Floyd was also found at autopsy to have fentanyl levels sufficient to kill a human being 3 times over.
Wow.
So he was going to die regardless.
And I'm
of
here
what
in
it
North
is.
Pole to remind
It's
you the
just
holidays.
fighting with police and stuff.
Fourth, on top of all that,
Pumped it
Floyd
up.
tested positive for COVID, which we've all been assured by our government is a respiratory virus capable of inflicting horrific death upon millions of otherwise healthy people, much less someone with Floyd's compromised physiology. Indeed, we'd all been assured that someone who was COVID
definitely
positive,
very
who
vulnerable.
died from falling off a ladder, was properly considered to be a COVID fatality. I said earlier that what killed George Floyd was George Floyd. And by that I mean that it was Floyd's severely compromised physiology, unknown to the officers making Floyd's lawful arrest, his just ingested mouthful of meth tablets, unknown to the officers making Floyd's lawful arrest, his 3-fold lethal levels of fentanyl in his system, unknown to the officers making Floyd's lawful arrest, his COVID infection, unknown to the officers making Floyd's lawful arrest, and Floyd's own poor life choice to violently fight lawful arrest for 10 minutes that was the proximate and culpable cause of Floyd's death. While some or all of the factors may have been synergized by the police officer's use of force upon Floyd, that use of force doesn't qualify as criminal conduct unless it was done with malice or constituted misconduct. And
Yeah, or when he's referring to malice or misconduct, there wasn't overuse of force. It was shown, it was proven, and so there wasn't anything above and beyond your typical use of force that they applied, even though he was fighting and resistive to the officers. Once the force from George Floyd stopped, they stopped, right? I mean, that's just how you're trained when it comes to use of force.
there was zero evidence offered at trial that any use of force by the officers qualified as either malice or misconduct, except, of course, that the court allowed for the lie that it would be reasonable to ignore all the obvious proximate causes of Floyd's death, to pretend that none of that existed, and to instead pretend to believe that what was proximately responsible for Floyd's death being an unlawful killing was a knee-on-back restraint technique taught at the Minneapolis Police Academy for decades. Incidentally, when the medical examiner looked for evidence consistent with Chauvin having applied pressure with his knee sufficient to have caused Floyd's death, he was unable to cite even a scintilla of such evidence, noting in his report that there were no facial indications of restrained breathing. There was no injuries to the muscles of Floyd's neck or back. There was no chest wall soft tissues injuries, not even bruising. Incidentally, the PDF of this medical examiner's report is included in the description to today's show. That lie that it had to have been Chauvin's murder knee that killed Floyd was the basis for Chauvin's state-level convictions for unintentional second-degree murder, really a form of manslaughter, third-degree murder, really just another form of manslaughter, and second-degree manslaughter. Note that not one of these convictions was premised on Chauvin having any intent to kill Floyd at all. Chauvin was sentenced to 22 years in state prison for these state-level convictions, and Chauvin was then also charged at the federal level for Floyd's death, given the claim that he killed Floyd while acting under color of law as a police officer, and Chauvin pleaded guilty to the federal charges. I suspect he took that federal plea as part of a deal in which he would receive a concurrent federal sentence no longer than his state sentence, and that he would be allowed to serve both sentences concurrently in a federal rather than state prison, where he may have believed he had an expectation of being safer than if he were in a Minneapolis state prison.
Which it wasn't, because he got stabbed in prison anyways, because, he's law enforcement, so you're hated by real villains out there in prison. So it's understandable what happened there. That supposedly federal prison is supposed to be safer, supposedly.
In fact, as an aside, in November 2023, Chauvin would be stabbed some 20 times by another inmate who claimed he was acting in support of the Black Lives Matter movement.
And it's funny because he did all that for nothing, because you almost lost a life. So Chauvin survived the stabbings for some punishment that he didn't even deserve, for being locked up, for being stabbed, all because of lies, right? And the guy ran on a lie because he didn't know any better. He just said, "Oh, I'm just doing it for BLM." Now, how stupid does he feel when that it was all just lies?
In any case, that brings us back around to the recent federal court decision in Chauvin's federal conviction. Chauvin is appealing his federal conviction on the grounds of ineffective assistance of counsel. As it happens, Chauvin had the same defense attorney, Eric Nelson, for both his state trial and the federal plea deal. Chauvin's now being represented by different counsel. Chauvin's current claim is that his trial attorney and federal plea attorney, Eric Nelson, provided ineffective assistance of counsel by failing to bring to Chauvin's attention information from a medical doctor that proposed yet another mechanism of Floyd's death independent of any malice or misconduct by Chauvin.
Yeah, I would fire the attorney
This
too.
physician, Dr. William Schetzel, had informed Nelson that it was quite possible that what killed Floyd was the consequence of the already compromised physiology I've already discussed, with the final straw being a catecholamine cascade caused by the paraganglioma tumor found by the medical examiner to be present in Floyd's pelvis. It's the theory of Dr. Schetzel that the combination of Floyd's violent resistance to lawful arrest and his otherwise compromised physiology, that it triggered this paraganglioma tumor to release an abrupt cascade of catecholamines, which have the effect of inducing an acute heart failure, pulmonary edema.
That's fine. I mean, the tumor can... But the point of it is that Floyd was a mess when it came to his health condition anyway. So any one of the health issues that he was already having pre-existing, I mean, along with the tumor, it wasn't he was 100% healthy. He was a mess in terms of he was going to go at any time, and the drugs triggered it, the fighting, all the stuff that he did. is what the attorney here says, that yeah, George Floyd killed himself, and George Floyd killed George Floyd. He's the one that got himself killed. Um, it's just the things, the actions, and everything else exacerbated the death. Um, you know, and not the officer. It's just it played a part, but it wasn't direct. All right, it was all the chemical reactions within the body reacting, and it was the final straw for George Floyd.
An impaired ability to breathe, and subsequently death. Obviously, neither the presence of George Floyd's tumor nor its medical consequences could possibly have been known to the officers making their lawful arrest of Floyd.
Of course not.
Every criminal defendant has a U.S. constitutional right to effective assistance of counsel. So a claim of ineffective assistance of counsel is a frequent basis for appeal of a conviction. Normally, of course, a guilty plea is difficult to appeal. Often a condition of taking a plea deal is that you're waiving all rights to appeal. In this particular case, however, Chauvin is arguing that he would never have agreed to the plea had he known about this tumor-mediated catecholamine cascade theory of Floyd's death, and that therefore Nelson's failure to bring this theory to his attention prior to taking the plea constitutes ineffective assistance of counsel, and his federal conviction ought therefore to be reversed. The federal court that heard these arguments has given them sufficient credibility that it's ordered that Chauvin's legal team be provided with samples of Floyd's heart tissue and relevant bodily fluids collected during Floyd's autopsy. The PDF of this federal court order is also included in the description of today's show. Of course, even if successful at the federal level, this appeal would have no immediate direct effect upon his state conviction. How it might apply to state level is something not within my own area of expertise, really, though I can imagine a variety of...
I would challenge that too, then, because if it's a successful appeal federally, I would definitely challenge the state, because we know the state was slanted and was withholding information in the first place. And so, hey, you know what? A step at a time, right? And justice will eventually prevail. And I'm glad to see that this is happening, because it's been an injustice to the criminal justice system that we're experiencing here, obviously, because we saw everything that's been going on with soft on crime, the catch and release, the illegals, all the flash mob, store robberies, you name it. And it's all because of liberal, progressive, blue city Democrats and state Democrats that's responsible for all this that's happened. And we're trying to rein it all back in and get back to what it was. All right, it's okay to enforce laws. It's okay to punish people for crimes they commit, because that's the right thing. All right, so I'm glad to see this is happening.
News of attack, perhaps on habeas corpus grounds. In any case, of course, the real travesty in this case is that due process of law mandates that a defendant cannot be convicted of a crime unless his guilt has been proven beyond any reasonable doubt. A reasonable alternative hypothesis for Floyd's death, by definition, raises a reasonable doubt over whether it was Chauvin's purported malice or misconduct that caused Floyd's death.
Which wasn't proven that. And it was already clear from the autopsy. So I don't know. I'm just glad this is being looked at again, and they're giving Derek Chauvin a chance to really prove. And he'll definitely. I mean, it's all there. So there's no way they can deny the appeal and say, "Oh no, he's still guilty." No, it's going to be overturned. That's what I believe. Let me know what you think. Comment down below. Subscribe, hit the bell icon. That way we can stay on top of new updates on just anything and everything. Other than that, thanks. I'll see you next one.